Greetings, everyone. I'm Suzannah Clark, director of the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Morton B. Knoefel Professor of Music at Harvard University. Welcome to you all for joining us today in this beautiful building, Memorial Church. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's very special occasion of the 2024 Hauser Forum featuring the Eybler Quartet. 13 years ago, a generous gift from Rita E. Hauser established this forum. Rita Hauser is an international lawyer. She has served in various capacities on the national and international stage, focusing on global peace and human rights, including serving as United States Ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council. In 1999, Rita Hauser was awarded the Harvard Medal in recognition of her distinguished service to Harvard University, and in 2008 was honored with the award of the Women's Leadership Summit of Harvard Law School. Rita Hauser is also a champion of the arts, and her vision for the Hauser Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center is to bring to Harvard's campus major figures in the arts to reflect on their own artistic practices. I would like to thank Rita Hauser for her generous support for today's event. And for seeing to all the preparation for today's event, I'm also grateful to Bruno Carvalho, who has been the interim director of the Mahindra Humanities Center while I have been on sabbatical this year. So I've come out of sabbatical for this wonderful event. I'd also like to thank Steve Beal, the executive director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, and to Mary McKinnon, the events coordinator, and of course, to the rest of the outstanding staff at the center. We at the center are extremely proud to have the Eybler Quartet as our 2024 Hauser Forum artists. The Eybler Quartet formed in 2004, so this year they are celebrating their 20th anniversary. And they come to us from Toronto, Ontario, in Canada, where they are based. And they're a quartet that specializes in the early origins of the string quartet from the 18th century to the early 19th centuries. In their performances, the Eybler Quartet is known for reviving music that has not been heard since it was written and performed in the 18th and 19th centuries. They've recorded, for example, some quartets of their namesake, Joseph Eybler, who was a close friend of Mozart's. And they're about to release a recording of quartets by Franz Weiss, who, aside from being a composer in his own right, was perhaps more famous for the fact that he knew Beethoven and gave the premieres of many of Beethoven's very difficult late quartets. He was a violist. The Eybler Quartet performed these rediscovered works alongside their dynamic performances of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And indeed, it is their exploration of the broader history of the early quartet that has given them such fresh and inspired interpretations of the giants of the era, such as Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Their recordings of Beethoven's Opus 18 quartets, for example, experiment with Beethoven's original metronome markings. So the metronome was a newly invented machine at the time of Beethoven that allowed composers to match the tick-tock of the metronome to the beat of the music in order to indicate precisely how fast a piece should go. However, in classical music, we often get used to certain traditions and we become accustomed to hearing famous pieces of music in certain ways. And the general tradition for the performance of Beethoven's early quartets doesn't match Beethoven's own metronome markings. So by delving into the original sources to reconstruct how Beethoven might have expected his music to be heard, the Eybler Quartet's recordings use Beethoven's original markings, metronome markings, from 1818, which means that some of the movements are very different from how we are accustomed to hearing them. The Eybler Quartet also plays on period instruments. That is, they play on instruments as they were in the 18th century, before technological developments came about in the 19th century. So, for example, the bow is a different shape from the modern bow. The strings are gut strings instead of metal strings, and there's no chin rest. So the invention of the chin rest was meant to make it easier to shift around on the fingerboard, going up and down the strings. So in the 18th century, players would have had a more lateral movement across the strings rather than with the chin rest up and down. So all of these technological factors mean that performers make different decisions about how to perform the music, which brings about a different sound quality, usually a more mellow sound quality, but a lot of variety of other things too, compared to the use of modern instruments. But today, the Eybler Quartet will be focusing on another aspect that they are well known for. And as you can see from the overhead behind me, the title of their talk is All the Feelings, the Embodiment of Passion in the String Quartet in the 18th century. They will be focusing on what is called the doctrine of affections. This was a doctrine from the 17th or 18th century revival and reinterpretation of ancient Greek principles of rhetoric and oratory. Many 18th century treatises are brimming with evocative definitions of the range of human passions or human emotions and feelings. Now, as evocative as these written descriptions are, the question is, how do you translate these written descriptions into musical sound? And how do performers prepare themselves to bring out these passions in the music? So these are some of the questions that the Eybler Quartet will be addressing today. And the piece of music they will use to demonstrate the passions that they talk about is Mozart's quartet in C major, known by the nickname the Dissonance Quartet, and it was composed in 1785. This quartet was the last of 6 quartets that Mozart dedicated to Haydn. These quartets stand out in Mozart's output because, contrary to Mozart's usual reputation that he composed effortlessly, the autograph manuscripts of these quartets show lots of corrections, changes of mind, and even struggles with the technical details of counterpoint. Mozart himself, in his dedication to Haydn, pointed out that he labored over the writing of these quartets. So a little bit about the format of today's presentation. The Eybler Quartet will begin by playing a section, so not the whole movement, but a section of the first movement of Mozart's Dissonance Quartet. And this, as it were, will get you into the sound world of Mozart. Then they will move into their talk with illustrations of the passions in both treatises and with excerpts from the Mozart Quartet. Listen carefully, some of these extracts are short and sweet, so when they come up, they go by fast. And then after that, I will come back up onto the stage for a little bit of a discussion. And as a little sneak preview of that moment, it's when I get back on stage that we'll explain why this quartet got its nickname, the Dissonance. And after the discussion with me, I'm going to turn it back to them again for a performance now of the full movement of the finale, or the last movement of Mozart's quartet. But don't leave, because at that point we will open the floor for questions from the audience to our esteemed guests. Now, before I hand it over to them, I just want to add one more thing, if I may, and that is that it is for me indeed a personal pleasure to have the Eyblers here at Harvard. I first met the quartet in 2017 when we were all faculty for a summer program on the evolution of the string quartet in the Banff Center for the Arts in Alberta, Canada. They invited me to sit in on their rehearsals, and I learned a tremendous amount from them. It has in fact transformed the way I think about the history of music theory and about performance practices. And it's this experience that inspired this particular invitation for them to speak to you as our 2024 Hauser Forum artists. So a quartet obviously is made up of 4 instruments, 2 violins, viola, and cello. And so today, the 2 violinists often when they play in concerts exchange who plays the first violin and who plays the second violin part. But today, on the first violin, we have Julia Wedman, and on the second violin, we have Patricia Ahern, and our violist is Patrick Jordan, and the cellist is Margaret Gay. So now they will play, as I said, an extract from the first movement of the Dissonance Quartet, and then they will begin their presentation.
Thank you so much, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here in Boston and at Harvard. It's actually my very first time at Harvard, so I'm very excited, especially after hearing about it from Susie so much over the years. Thank you, Susie, for such a beautiful introduction, and I would also like to add that we have also been transformed by our relationship with Susie, and the way we think about music has changed. So it's been a very fruitful relationship over the years. So as Susie said, that was part of the first movement of Mozart's String Quartet in C major, K465, also known as the Dissonance Quartet. And everything we play today will be taken from this quartet. As you might guess from the title of this lecture, we as a group love to learn about how we can best express the emotions and feelings of the music we play. And we try to approach this with an 18th century sensibility, since we play mostly 18th century and early 19th century music. And we really use research to guide and inspire our process of discovery and of creativity. And one lens that we sort of look at everything through is through the 18th century aesthetic theory of the doctrine of affections. And this is basically the idea that music has the power to affect people's emotions to such an extreme degree that it can actually make people sick, or conversely, to heal people. And now this is why you'll hear, if you've ever been kind of confused, as I was in my early days of playing Baroque music, why when you go to a big Baroque opera, or even you hear a big Baroque suite of music like Handel's Fireworks, for example, why is the very last piece of music something that is, simple, elegant minuet, or some kind of dorky little something? And you think, well, we've just had this incredible, dramatic opera, and this is what we're ending with? And the doctrine of affections is the reason why. And composers felt that they would be taking the audience on this huge journey of emotions, and they didn't want to send their audience members out into the streets hysterical. So they would write something at the end to return our emotions to a sense of neutrality and to something a little bit more calm. And throughout this lecture, when we talk about emotions, you'll also hear us kind of interchangeably use the terms emotions, passions, and also affect, which was another term that 18th century musicians were using. Now, one of our favorite books that was written, a more contemporary book about Baroque music and early music, classical music, is called The Pathetic Musician by Bruce Haynes and Jeffrey Burgess. And in this book, they discuss 3 elements that make music written before 1800 different than later music. And the first thing they talk about was that music before 1800 was written to mean something. There was no kind of concept of absolute music or music just for music's sake. Music was written to express something, to mean something. The second thing was that music was not written just to be beautiful. Beauty might be part of an emotion, like love, for example, but beauty, as we understand it today, was not ever the goal of music. And then the third thing is a focus on individual expressions. So pre-1800, there wasn't the concept of, a musician, like a performing violinist as an icon, somebody who we went to a concert hall and we revered and admired, but didn't really understand. But pre-1800 musicians were supposed to be playing music, making music that people could understand, could relate to. We were supposed to be making music and sharing emotions together with our audience. And we take a huge amount of inspiration from musicians and writers from the 18th century. And we wanted to share with you today a few of our kind of all-time favorite quotes from 18th century musicians.
In 1752, Frederick the Great's favorite flute player, Johann Joachim Quantz, wrote in his treatise on playing the flute, and we're quoting here, so some of the language may be a bit dated. Good execution must be expressive and appropriate to each passion that one encounters. The performer of a piece of music must seek to enter into the principal and related passions that he is to express. And since in the majority of pieces, one passion constantly alternates with another, the performer must know how to judge the nature of the passion that each idea contains, and constantly make his execution conform to it. Only in this manner will he do justice to the intentions of the composer and to the ideas that he had in mind when he wrote the piece.
Italian composer and violinist Francesco Gemignani wrote in the first sentence of his treatise, The Art of Playing on the Violin, from 1751. The intention of music is not only to please the ear, but to express sentiments, strike the imagination, affect the mind, and command the passions.
The German composer, theorist, and writer on music, Johann Mattheson, from whom we will hear several times this evening, wrote in The Complete Music Director from 1739, "My humble advice at the end of this chapter, which connects the natural philosophy of sound with the doctrine of the affects in certain necessary ways, is as follows. One ought to choose one or the other good, or very good, poetic work in which nature is vividly depicted and strive to distinguish exactly the passions contained therein. For without doubt, the things of many a composer or judge of music would turn out better if only he himself now and then realized what he actually wished to achieve." So, as Julie has alluded, we are working in a period of music that is driven by the composer-performer. So the line between composers and performers is a very fluid one as a general rule in this period. That is also true today in some cases, but not in the same way that it was in the 18th century. So what we get in terms of the text of music is a framework, a blueprint, if you will. We get most of the notes, depending on the sources we work from. Sometimes that's open to question. We get instructions about how quickly and how slowly we might want to play, although that's sometimes optional as well. We're supposed to just know sometimes. We're sometimes given information about how loudly or softly we might play. We are sometimes given information about whether we might slur two notes together, sing a longer line with a set of notes. And all of that falls in the world of, since the parts are separate, we don't look at a whole score in the 18th century typically. Often the parts are different, so we have to negotiate all of that. And our object there really is to find a way to understand the emotional content of the music and put that in our bodies so that when we put it in our bodies, it comes out to you in that, so that we create these emotional characters that populate the work. So we're going to invite you into how we work, our creative process. We really do have conversations about these affects in rehearsals and go hammer and tong sometimes about what this means and various shades of emotional meaning. But the first step here is to map out the territory. And so here's an image of what we affectionately refer to as Julia's affect chart. And since it's her chart, I'm going to hand it over to her.
So this is a tool that I developed quite early in my teaching career in order to help students understand how to express emotion in music, and specifically in terms of violin technique, how to use our right arm. So our right arm, my arm that I use for bowing, is our main tool of expression. So we have to be virtuosos of the right arm. We have to know exactly how to use it. And so I ended up developing this chart. And if you'll take a quick look at it with me, you'll see that on up and down, we have energy. So that talks about how much energy goes into a specific emotion. And then on the bottom, we have quality of movement or quality of emotion. On one side, there's a minus, so that's a negative quality of an emotion. And on the other side, there's a plus, so that's the positive qualities of emotions. So I'm just gonna have you brainstorm a little bit with me. So think of an emotion that we can kind of put at in some of the different places. So if you think of an emotion that is positive, that has a high amount of energy in it, what would that be? You can put your hand up or just shout out, I don't care. Anybody? When you're in a really, really good mood, you're really happy, you got a lot of energy, how do you feel? Yeah. Excitement. Yeah. Good. And like super, and if we would think of something that goes to 100, it would be like, I just won the lottery kind of excitement, like super, super, super excited. Okay, and then if we go across, what is something that has a high amount of energy, but very negative in quality? Yes, exactly. That's a perfect one. Yeah, exactly. And then if we go down, let's go down from there. Let's keep it on the negative side and go to the very bottom, something that is very negative, but you don't feel any energy. What kind of emotion is that? Apathy, somebody said. Yeah, exactly. Something, apathy, or when, sometimes when we have something that's very negative, we might even think of like depression, something that like, I feel so terrible, I cannot move, I can't get out of bed, that kind of thing. But if we go to the positive side of that, what is something that's no energy, but positive? Imagine a beautiful summer day. Imagine yourself on the dock of a beach, on a beach. Maybe you've been fishing and boating all day, and it's sunset, and it's been the most wonderful day, and all your energy is gone, and you're just listening to the waves and being where you are. What kind of emotion is that? Yeah, carefree, exactly. Yeah, and we might also call it contentment or peace, all those kinds of things. So maybe I'll have you go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of a tool that we can use to start actually being a little bit more scientific about what are we doing with our bodies and how much energy goes into all these emotions. So we're going to explore some of the passions one by one. And the first one we're going to explore is, of course, one of my favorite ones, joy. And another one of our sources for inspiration in working with these passions is the English actor Aaron Hill's essay on the art of acting from 1753. And Aaron Hill was the stage director for Handel's opera Rinaldo in London. So he was very connected with musicians in the Baroque world. And Aaron Hill describes joy like this. Joy is pride, possessed of triumph. It is a warm and conscious expansion of the heart, indulging a sense of present pleasure and comparing it with past affliction. It cannot, therefore, be expressed without vivacity in look, air, and accent. So you might not have been anticipating this much audience participation this evening, but we want you to have an idea of what it's like to be us. So we are going to ask everybody to stand up if you are able, and I'm going to teach you a little exercise that I do with my students. And as you stand up, I just want to draw your attention to an image, which is an engraving after the 17th century artist Charles Le Brun, who made a systematic study of how to capture the human affects or emotions in paintings and drawings. And we'll be showing you several of these slides as the presentation goes on. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just put your feet firmly planted on the ground and just shake out your body a little bit. Sure. Change this one. And we want to start, can I have this other mic on? There, thank you very much. So we want to kind of let all the feelings of the day, anything that you've been thinking about or worrying about or even happy about, just let those go. We always want to start from a point of neutrality. And let's take a nice breath out. Good. A little shake, shake, shake. Okay, so feel your feet really grounded on the floor. And I want you to feel the energy of the floor, of the earth, coming up through your legs. Let it come up slowly. Let the energy come up through the stomach, all the way up to the chest, and let the chest expand. Shoulders back. And release the back of the neck. Relax the back of the neck. Unfurl your brow. Put a smile on your face and a twinkle in your eye. Now, try to move your arms. How do they feel? Pretty good. Yeah, they feel pretty free. And this freedom is what we need in our arms when we play joy. Okay, you can sit down. Very good. Moving to the realm of music, the composer Jóhann Matthíasson describes joy's application this way. Since joy is perceived as an expansion of vital spirits, it follows rationally and naturally that I can express this affect best by large and expanded intervals. And just in case there's somebody that doesn't know or doesn't remember what intervals are, intervals just mean the space between two notes. So if we have a small interval, we have a small amount of space between two notes. Pat, can you play us a small interval? Great. And if we have a large interval, that means there's a big space between the two notes. Perfect. So we're going to play an example for you of joy, and this comes from the last movement of the Dissonance Quartet. And this is a very short example. And as Susie was saying, one of the challenges in trying to find affects in Mozart is that he is a master at changing affects incredibly quickly. So a lot of our excerpts are short. So we just show you the one affect. So this is very short, but it's full of large intervals, leaping intervals. And then we're going to play another little excerpt for you. And this next one is from the end of the opening movement of the Dissonance Quartet. And again, with leaping intervals. And, as we were rehearsing this and writing this lecture, we started thinking, is this the place that the term jumping for joy comes from?
having explored joy, we'll put this into lower energy and a more negative sense of emotion and explore sadness a little bit. Here is De Bruyn's image for sadness. Aaron Hill describes sadness this way: sadness is disappointment, void of hope. It is a mournful and unstruggling resignation of defense to apprehension of calamity, and therefore must require, to express it rightly, a sad look, careless air, and voice unraised and indolent. So we find it very illustrative to put these demonstrations of affect right next to each other. So if you are able and would be willing to rise again, we'll repeat what we did with Julia in the embodiment of joy, and then we'll move to sadness, just so you feel the shift in those things. So again, find a neutral place. Feel your feet solidly connected to the earth, and feel the energy of the ground come up through your legs, into your torso, through and expand the chest. Relax the back of your neck. Unfurl your brow. Smile on your face, and a twinkle in your eye. And there you go, and your arms are again feeling free. So let's work to sadness from here. So first, let your arms just come to your sides. Allow your jaw and face to slacken. Darken your forehead. Shoulders down and forward. Eyes down. Slowly exhale. Allow your limbs to feel heavy. Release the core of your body and allow your energy to drain into the ground. Now move your arms. Not quite the same feeling of freedom. So, thank you. You can sit down. Bringing this back into the realm of music, here's our friend Johann Mattheson again on the topic of sadness. Sadness is a contraction of such subtle parts of our body, one can easily imagine that small and the smallest intervals are the most appropriate to this passion. So the example that we'll use is from the second movement of the Mozart quartet, and this example features an undulating line in the cello, so I'll ask Margaret to play a few notes of her line. So very narrow interval, small interval. And Julia, I'll ask you also to play your part. So the top three parts will play a version of what Julia just played, exchanging that line. Think about that, that's also a very narrow, small interval. In fact, the first notes that she plays are exactly the same note. So it's harder for notes to get closer together than being exactly the same note. So here's the example with those parts put together.
Now we come to my favorite affect, which is anger. Here's Lebrun's image for anger. And Aaron Hill's description is as follows. Anger is pride provoked beyond regard of caution. It is a fierce and unrestrained effusion of reproach and insult. It must therefore be expressed impatiently by a fiery propension in the eye, with a disturbed and threatening air, and with a voice strong, swift, and often interrupted by high swells of choking indignation. Let's stand up and do some anger. First of all, the joints are braced. There's energy in the body. The blood is impelled into violent motion. Fire in the eyes. Teeth are set. Nostrils are wide. Have a furrowed and furious brow. Breath is fast, restrained, and inflamed by the tumultuous emotions. Now, make sure you don't hurt your neighbor. You have all this energy. On the count of 3, you can either punch or yell. 1, 2, 3. Ah! Thank you. Sit down. And again, here is Matheson on less pleasant affects. For although the musical profession should concern itself primarily with grace and pleasure, it also works at times with dissonant sounds or harsh sounding themes and appropriately strident instruments to represent not only matters adverse and unpleasant, but even horrible and dreadful, in which the mind occasionally finds a particular delight. Our first musical example for anger is from the minuet and trio of this Mozart quartet. In this short example, we go from pent-up anger to brief but violent outbursts. Our second example of anger is from the finale. It has a number of remarkable features, one of which is this reoccurring interval. It's called the tritone. And in the time of Mozart, it was known as the devil's interval. Margaret, would you please play a tritone for us? So musicians used this when they wanted something particularly scary or angry or hurtful or painful. We will hear that interval over and over again in this passage. And it had the association of being highly dissonant, painful, and therefore diabolical.
Aaron Hill's description of love is quite wonderful. Love is desire kept temperate by reverence. It is expanded softness in the heart, indulged attachment in the fancy, and an awe for fear to be distasteful where we wish to please upon the spirits. It can never, therefore, rightfully be expressed without a look of apprehensive tenderness that softens the high-braced and animated air and casts a modest cloud of diffidence over too quick a sense of transport. And thus we are come, at last, to a passion the true name thereof might be legion, for it includes all the others in all their degrees and varieties. So as there isn't really one set of gestures or feelings around love, I'm not going to ask you all to stand. Lebrun also illustrates what could possibly be constituent parts of different kinds of love. So our slide here shows one possible form of love, something as simple as admiration. A very different form of love might be some mixture of rapture and desire. And yet another might be some mixture of veneration and admiration. And we could always just throw in a little jealousy. Pulling us back to the music, Aaron Hill and Johann Mattheson are very much on the same page. Mattheson concludes his section on specific affects with this: to list here each and every emotion would surely be too tedious. Only the most distinguished ones must not be left untouched. Love, to be sure, ought to be ranked above all others, since it holds a place more eminent than any other passion in musical matters. In this respect, what matters is that the composer distinguish exactly the degree, the type, or kind of love he is confronted with, or which he selected as his subject. The diffusion of spirits mentioned above, from which this emotional tendency generally and specifically originates, can be expressed in many ways, and it is impossible to treat all kinds of love in the same manner. We have 3 musical examples to illustrate this. The first is drawn from the second movement and gives a glimpse of what we think of as mutual admiration. There are 2 voices, mine and Julia's, singing a duet back and forth, having eyes only for one another. We're going to play only the 2 voices first.
Now we'll move to the full text that Mozart wrote, where Tricia and I are providing a supportive community for this mutual admiration.
Our next example is from the opening movement and is a short excerpt from what we played at the very beginning. This one for us represents a heart quietly brimming with contented love. Our final example for this part of our presentation takes us back to the second movement, back to the second movement. Mozart uses the same basic love duet material as in the mutual admiration example, but let's face it, love can get quite complicated. This example feels to us like love evolving through the passions.
So now we're going to have a little discussion with me, but before we do that, let's have a round of applause for this part of the presentation. So one of the things, as I said, that we would do before concluding is that they will perform the full last movement. And so this part of our discussion is really to prepare you for that experience at that moment, to give you a little sense of how it goes. And so we're going to concentrate on the opening of the piece. And we're also going to do a little experiment as to, how to put all these passions that we've learned into practice. So the first thing I'm going to ask the quartet to do, by the way, they don't know exactly what I'm going to ask them to do, so is to play as they plan to play it when they perform it to us in a few minutes. So this is just the opening, what we call the first theme of the last movement. Excellent. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is give them an affect or a passion, and they're going to play it the way I ask. And so what I'm going to ask them to do is that I think you can agree was joy with a little impishness. So let's go for the opposite and do sadness. So obviously what you heard there, right, was a sense that now there's a kind of caressing that they did. They sort of negotiated all the smaller intervals as they went along, right? Now, Mozart himself was like, well, I did have a happy and fun tune at the beginning, but because it's in sonata form, there's a development section. And so at the beginning of the development section, what Mozart actually does, and we're going to hear this in a minute, is he puts it into the minor mode, which is sort of the composer's trick to make something instantly sound a little bit more sad, right? So in other words, Mozart changed the music, inherently changed the music so that it would sound sad, right? So what we just heard when they played the first time and then the sadness time was exactly the same notes. But this time, what I'm going to do is ask them to play the opening of the movement in their merry way that they plan to play, and then turn to the development section also as they plan to play it, but you'll hear that Mozart's made the changes. It goes from major to minor. And now the development in minor. And so now I'm going to ask them for something else. And by the way, we got them to stand up so that hopefully you can see the sort of what their body does to do the, and I'll get out of your way so you can see, sorry. So yeah, look at the body language, and I'm going to give them another emotion to play. Are you guys ready? Off the top again, yep. Are you ready for some pride? Excellent. Nice pride. Can I now ask you maybe for a little explanation as to what you did to achieve the difference there between sadness and pride? Who would like to? Should I give you the mic? Yeah.
Sure. So you might have noticed that we assembled our bodies in a proud way, standing up nice and tall. I also think of something proud as not hurried. So I think the speed of the music was slightly slower. Maybe our eighth notes were slightly more deliberate in nature. Would you like to play some eighth notes first? Happy eighth notes. And then some proud, a little bit more stately eighth notes. Exactly.
All right, should we do maybe two more? Are you ready?
Oh, Susie, yes. I also want to, I just sort of want to turn your attention to a couple of other things that we end up changing depending on the affect. One is dynamic, how loudly or softly we play, and articulation, which means how long or short we play the notes. Another thing is rubato, how much time we take in between phrases, how much like we push the tempo or pull the tempo, or how straight we play the tempo. What else am I missing?
Along the same lines of articulation, you would not believe the amount of time that we talk about what consonant begins a note. Is it a k, or is it a p, or is it a b, or is it a m? So that is it. I know that sounds kind of a nutty thing to do, but it makes a very big difference to your impression of the music. So when we played the sad version off the top, we slowed down, we played more softly, the articulations softened a great deal, there was more rubato. So there, all these things, all these tools are available to us to make. I mean, we would never play it that way because the clues in the music tell us something else, but we like playing this game with Susie.
All right, so I'm going to ask for two more. Yeah. and then we'll move on to the next thing. But okay, so next, how about wonder? And now fear. Oh, yeah.
Because it's also one of my favorite affects. And why it's difficult wonder is quite difficult in this musical material, because the thing about wonder is something like, for example, when I walked in here today, and you walk in and you're like, oh, wow, what a beautiful place. And when you are in wonder, things kind of stop. Like, it's like time stops. So when there's wonder in music, it's often when all of a sudden nothing's happening. And Aaron Hill talks about that ever so slightly, it's like the blood stops, the blood rushes out of your veins, and little by little, it starts coming in. So I tried at the beginning to play in a very still manner, and then as the phrase went on, I was rushing a little bit because the blood was coming back into my veins.
Would you like to do Fear? It's the last one. Great, thank you so much. So in a way, right, what I hope that does is kind of prepares you for the movement when they play the full last movement, because that little snippet of melody will come back over and over again. And often it's Mozart who's trying to give indications to, change the affect, but also the performer can add things in as well. But as I said at the very beginning, one of the things we were going to do is we promised you was to explain why this is called the Dissonance Quartet. And a few moments ago, you heard a demonstration from Margaret about a tritone, or the devil's interval, right? And as Tricia explained, that is a kind of go-to interval or a go-to sound for composers at the time whenever they wanted to express something diabolical, right? So even though music theorists will write about this as a particularly monstrous harmony, and they recommend you don't use it except in very certain circumstances, composers used it all the time, so it was a little bit of a run-of-the-mill dissonance. So that's not what gave this quartet its name. What gave it its name is something that we've not heard the quartet play at all yet, and that is the very opening, the slow introduction to the first movement. So when they played the first movement at the very beginning of this evening, they started from the fast bit and not playing the slow introduction. But this slow introduction is about a minute of material that for at least a century was considered absolutely outrageous. Now, if you listen to it now, you might think, oh, it's not so bad. But, you've had Beethoven, you've had Stravinsky, you've had heavy metal, all kinds of, sounds to hear, right? But what I want to kind of do is to take you back to what it would have been like for an audience or even players playing this for the very first time, and finding out that Mozart has given them some shocking surprises. So as Pat mentioned along the way, he said, well, one of the things is each person has their own part. And the idea of publishing a score often came much later than the parts. So in other words, this particular piece, the publication of the parts came from 1785, but the score wasn't published until the early 19th century. So in other words, what would have happened is performers would have bought their parts, sat down, they go, okay, let's play this. And then basically, when the first violinist comes in, so today that's Julia, they probably would have said, oh, wait, hang on, did you count properly, right? And they would have said, oh, wait, that's a wrong note. Then they would have gone through it again, and they go, oh my goodness, that's what's written. And they would have wondered what the heck was wrong with the publication, and that's what happened, right? So there's a number of stories. One is a number of theorists who came along and they were like, well, Mozart can't possibly have meant that, right? And they changed the score. That's one thing that happened in the middle of the 19th century. But there was also a count from Hungary who had his performers play it, and then he interrupted them. And he was like, what are you guys doing? And they said, well, we're playing what's in the score, and he ripped up the score. or he ripped up the parts rather, right? So there was a lot of discussion and violence actually around this particular opening. So what I'm going to do is ask them just to play the opening 4 measures, and I'm going to point to Julia for the offending dissonance. By the way, there's a lot of dissonances, but we're just going to focus on this one. Go ahead. Okay, and that goes on for a minute. And so to really give you a sense, because you had so many sort of short extracts, I'm going to ask them to play the whole of this introduction, and then they're going to go into, what was it, contented joy?
Yes.
A heart brimming with love, when they play just the very opening of the faster part of the movement. So whenever you listen to this quartet again, think of that moment as the most outrageous thing to have happened in the 18th century. And so without further ado, what I'm going to do now is they're going to play the whole of the finale. And what I hope for you is that you have a fun and different experience of listening to the music. See how Mozart changes the passions and the emotions on a dime. It's constantly going from one thing to another. This was something that Mozart was particularly good at. And then when they finished, I'm sure we can give them a round of applause, but we'll come back and have audience questions, and then the event will finish at 7:30 as we usually do. So over to the quartet to play the finale, the last movement of the Dissonance Quartet. And to you. Bravo, thank you so much. So now we have some time for questions, about 5 minutes or 6 minutes. We have some microphones that are going around, so if you raise your hand if you have a question. There's one over here, Richard.
Hi, thanks very much. How do you decide in the introduction to the first movement how dissonant to be? If that question's...
How do we decide?
How dissonant to be in the...
Oh, how dissonant to be.
Yeah.
That's a great question. So, a composer, that's a great question, because a composer will write specific chords or specific intervals that sort of in themselves, no matter how you play them, sound dissonant to a certain degree. And then we have some other tools at our disposal that will help us sound more or less dissonant. I wonder if we can... Yeah, I'm just wondering if we can play some examples from... There's a couple of things. What I did today was I played my note, which is the dissonant note, a tiny bit louder than everybody else. And I also played it with a sound that is very flat, so that it sounds like kind of a tone, a more nasal tone instead of a nice round. If I wanted it to sound nicer, like less dissonant, I would play it with a more open tone, like a more sweet sound. I might use a little vibrato as well to sweeten the sound. Sure.
So we'll play the first 4 measures, and Julie will play it more nicely. Same note, but nicely.
So I'll just give it a different, and also just the shape of my body and the way it actually has a lot to do with the chest being open or closed. That I'll just open a little bit, which means that the bow will flow a little bit more and get a less harsh sound on purpose. Yeah.
And when Julia played it nicely, we also reacted differently. So in the subsequent bars, we didn't make as big a crescendo. We didn't become as violent, really, because it was...
The crescendo
we had been invited to
is nicer, too.
Yeah, we had been invited to a different outcome. So, yeah, that's a good...
Great question. Thank you.
I should have taken a look at the score before. It's my shortcoming here. But what key are we starting in?
Great question. So there's, can I just add to, yeah. So there's a music theorist who, of course, called Gottfried Weber in the 19th century, who wrote 50 pages on the opening 4 measures. And he said, he made a whole chart, a Julie chart, except this is a Weber chart, to say that every single note that comes in, you think you're in a different key, and he calculates quickly how it, having 2 notes reduces the possibilities, having 3 reduces the possibilities, and he was the first person, he also invented Roman numerals, if anybody's done that in class, and basically is how, and he said, how do you situate yourself in all the possible keys for each note? And then he had a second volume in which he then writes that there are 9,000 possibilities of what can come between one thing and another, right? And and so he used this piece to explain that phenomenon, because you're supposed to kind of not know, or you don't know what key you're in. And this is part of what Mozart's trying to do, which is he's saying, I'm writing a quartet in C major, but hey, at the beginning, we really are lost. And it's not until the very end of the introduction that you kind of feel that you're arriving somewhere, and then boom, you're in C major, and it's lovely. But actually, let's hear from you, though.
I was going to say that sometimes in rehearsal we decompose, which means we find a harmony that we find a little strange, and we say, well, what if it had been something else? And then we change it to something else, and then we change it back again. And what does that do to us? Our expectation of harmony is everything. So if we expect it to be calm and nice, but suddenly it's not, then it changes how we play it.
And finally, I would say, I'm not going to go at Weber on this one, but also in our exploration of this particular passage, it's 22 bars. Another real disruption to the sort of musical contract with your audience. This music is usually, bam, ba da ba ba dum, ba da 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 dee dum. There's 4 bars and 4 bars, and whatever. It's however it works, 2 bars and 2 bars and then 4 bars. In this case, 22 bars goes by, 21 bars go by before all 4 of us articulate one thing together. The rest of it, it's all these individual parts squirming around in this sort of soup of tonal uncertainty, right? And then when he gets to the moment where we call it a moment of awe, this moment at the very end when we're on this dominant 7th chord that is going to launch us into another world, that's the first place where we all do one thing together in that 21 bars. So we have to wait that long.
Should we have one more question? Please.
Are there any major affects that people in the 18th century would have experienced, but which don't show up in the period's music, or are represented more rarely, like disgust or embarrassment?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think some are definitely easier than others to, and some are quite complex. And I would say even like in opera, for example, it's a little easier to try to figure out what they're doing because they do have text. And so especially for some of the difficult emotions, like I would say jealousy is actually kind of a difficult emotion to do because it like encapsulates a kind of a desire, but also anger. And so sometimes like I'm thinking I forget what opera it's from. There's a really big jealousy aria, and instead of trying to put all of the emotions into one musical element, Handel breaks it up into several musical elements. So you'll have like the anger part and then the desire part, and so sometimes that's how they will break up some of the more complex emotions, like a little bit like how we were explaining with love. Like you'll start with one that's a little bit more simple and more straightforward, and then you'll start combining it. And that's really one of the joys of playing this music, because in music, just like in life, emotions are not static. We can't sustain happiness for very long in music or life. But the same thing with sadness. And so to watch how the happiness develops or the anger develops and what happens to it is one of the most fascinating and fun things to do with music. Does anybody want to add?
Great. Well, I think we'll end with that. But I first of all want to say thank you to the Eybler Quartet, but also thank you for your participation. Thank you for coming. And I hope that this gives you a glimpse of using your emotional intuition as you're listening to music, and watch how, and listen to how these things change from one thing to another, or they stay, for a long period of time. But especially when you're listening to Mozart, as I said earlier, he changes emotion on a dime, and to my mind, is something that the Eybler Quartet brings out in a particularly spectacular way. So thank you very much for giving us a spectacular insight into Mozart's music and also into 18th century thought, and for bringing it to life for us in the magnificent way in which you do. So thank you.